At the beginning of this chapter, we said that there were 3 different types of loops: while loops, for loops, and for each loops. And in the last movie, we looked at while loops, and we got an understanding of how those work. Now let's take a look at for loops. For loops accomplish the exact same thing as while loops. They loop through bits of code, and they do it in the same sort of way. They do it while conditions are true, but the syntax is going to be a little different. And this may be more comfortable for some of you who have prior programming experience with other languages like C. For takes this form: for, open parentheses, a first expression, a second expression, a third expression, close parentheses, and then a statement. The first expression is evaluated at the very beginning of the loop for the very first time through the loop only. It's like an initializing statement. Happens only once. Expression 2 is an evaluated expression that happens at the beginning of every loop. That's the same as what we had in our while loop before. And the third one is going to be what happens at the end of each and every loop. So it may be helpful, instead of looking at it as just expression 1, expression 2, expression 3, to look at it as initial, test, and each. Initial is the initial value we're giving. We're initializing something. Test will be the test that we perform each time, and as long as it's true, we'll continue the loop. And each will be the action that we perform at the end of every loop before looping back to the top and doing the test again. Let's take a look at it in practice. Let's go ahead and create a new place for us to work on this, and we'll do that by doing a save as on our while loops, and we're going to just call this one for loops, F-O-R, for loops.php, and I'll save it in my sandbox. And let's go ahead and get rid of the bottom loop that we were working with here. But let's take one last look at the top loop before we get rid of it. There we go. Now, before, we were doing count equals 0. We were initializing count. And then we performed the test in the while, and we executed a statement. And the very last thing that we did was we updated count with a new value. That's the same thing as doing something at the bottom of each loop. And even when we had our if-then statement in there, we still always incremented count by 1 before going back to the top and testing. Let's now take a look at a for loop instead. This will perform exactly the same thing that while loop that we had was performing. Remember, the initialize is the first argument, and that's going to be that it's going to set count equal to 0. And we have a semicolon at the end to let it know that that's the end of the statement. Then we have a space followed by our test, which is as long as count is less than or equal to 10, keep running the loop. Then the last thing is going to be incrementing count. So we're going to, as a very last step, once we've executed the statement, we're going to execute this expression, count plus plus, and then go back and perform the test again at the top of the loop. So let's go ahead and try this for loop and see what we get back. We'll save it. We'll go back into our browser, and instead of while loops, we're going to ask it to return for loops to us. And you'll see that indeed we get exactly the same thing. Now the exact same things are going to be true for the for loops as they were for the while loops. We're going to want to make sure that we don't have loops that loop infinitely. We're going to be able to use if-then statements inside of them. We can even have loops inside of other loops. All of those things are still going to be possible. It's just a slightly different structure and format. So if you find this easier to use, definitely you should use it. I find that while often works a lot better for me. It's a lot more readable code. I'm more comfortable with it. So you'll see me using it more often. Now that we have an understanding of while loops and for loops, let's take a look at for each loops in the very next movie.